Number one, I want you all to understand what the structure of the OCI interview process is about. The OCI process is always going to follow the Law Society guidelines of the particular province that you're in. But by and large, the school will let you know what the relevant rules and guidelines you need to follow are. For example, will the firms be seeing you virtually or in person? Will there be any kind of like requirement to accept or reject the OCI interviews that you get? Make sure to follow all of these procedures. Something as simple as you getting a list of firms who are interested and failing to click accept could cost you in this process. If you know you're going to reject certain OCIs from certain firms, you're not interested in them, or you've decided to eliminate them, make sure you also click reject where required so that other people have an opportunity to interview with those firms. So don't be passive about this. Know what the rules are, know when the release dates for your OCI acceptance and rejections are, and then actually go and accept or reject if that's required. So please follow your law school guidelines according to the rules that they establish. I really, really want you all to keep in mind, no matter how competitive a candidate you are, you cannot interview with every single firm. The maximum number of firms you can possibly physically interview with, like in person or online, is 20 firms. There's no more time slots available after 20 slots. But I'm telling you from experience and from everything that I've heard over many, many years, you can't actually effectively do more than 15 interviews without suffering. So let's say you have a top 5 firms that you really want to interview with, and you are one of the fortunate candidates who has like 20 OCIs that you get, or even 17. If your top 5 firms end up at the bottom of your list that day, so they're the last 5 slotted in, you will be so exhausted by the time you get to them that you will have essentially thrown away your best chance at getting hired there. So I'm recommending 12 to 15 on the upper end for the number of OCIs you accept. If you have more than 15, I'm going to suggest you start whittling down and cutting firms from your list. I have heard of students in the past who have stretched it to 17, but even they have come back to me and reported that those last few interviews were a wash. They were drained, they were exhausted, they were burnt out, and they did not put on their best performance. Don't waste your time and don't waste the firm's time. Aim for a sweet spot of 12 to 15 on the upper end. If you have fewer than that, that's fine too. So just letting you know, you don't choose your schedule for which firm you will see in which order, and 12 to 15 is that sweet spot on the upper end. Now, they say that the OCIs are 20 minutes, but I want to make this clear. You actually only have 17 minutes to interview. The final 3 of those 20 minutes are for the interviewers to take some time to evaluate and grade you according to a rubric. I will show you what one of those sample rubrics looks like so you're aware of what they're evaluating you on. In those 17 minutes, you are likely to meet with 1 to 2 panelists. Typically, it's either 1 or 2 associates, possibly a junior and a senior associate, or in some cases, you may get an associate and a partner, or an associate and somebody from the hiring committee, so a legal talent or recruitment manager. Make sure when you are interviewing that you are speaking to both people and that you're not neglecting attention toward one or another. You want to engage the entire audience. The evaluation metrics, which I will show you a little bit more specifically, combine how well you answer personality-based questions. We call them motivational questions. So why law school? What motivates you? Behavioral questions. Tell me about a time when you had to solve a problem as part of a team. And even information style questions. So what are your practice areas of interest? These are just easy tick marks for you to get. Be clear about what you want. Be clear about why you're at the firm. Be clear about what your brand is. And I'll teach you how to do all of that. The OCIs are often called conversational. Now, let me ask you in the audience something. Does conversational style interview mean you don't have to prepare? Does a conversational style interview mean, hey, it's casual, you don't have to prepare? Literally everybody in the chat is saying no, thank you. Would anyone like to explain why conversational does not mean lack of preparation? I can just go in and wing it. It's just conversational, because that is something that people have said. I thought it was conversational. Why do I have to prepare? Why do we still need to prepare even if it's conversational? Anyone want to put their hand up and just, in the interest of time, just shout it out?
Because at the end of the day, it's still an interview, and you're still here to get the position, and there's still the professional and the interviewer, but ultimately people want to work with somebody that they look forward to coming in to work every day, and someone that they enjoy, but also someone that's going to thrive in that environment and help their business thrive as well.
Amazing. That's a great answer, Yara. Thank you so, so much. Conversations that in a formal interview that say non-conversational, it might be the equivalent of presenting somebody with a cake. They ask a question, you monologue the full response, almost like you're giving the whole cake over. A conversational interview is still the delivery of the cake to the interviewer, but it's done in pieces. For example, hi, Hana, tell me a bit about what you did last summer. Absolutely happy to tell you. I worked as a research assistant for Professor X at my law school. Interesting. Can you tell me more about your research? For sure. So this past summer, my focus was on XYZ topic. This is what I delivered. Interesting. Can you tell me more about that? For sure. The memo really focused on these 3 areas, and here were the challenges I encountered, and here's how I overcame them. I could have said that in a monologue. A conversation simply splits up the content and allows the other person to remain engaged and to lead where you're going to deliver the content, what angle you're going to approach it from, but there is no less content being delivered. So conversational, to Yara's point, still requires a high degree of preparation, but fluidity. So we're not looking to build scripts in this process. We're looking to have a sense of what the key information is, and we can be flexible about how it's delivered. So if you find you've got a cold bench, which is just a term for saying stiff interviewers who aren't really making conversation, it is incumbent upon you to get them engaged. Have you ever written a memo for a prof before? Okay, it can be really tricky sometimes. Or have you, do you remember what it was like when you wrote your first assignment or legal memo? You were a bit lost, right? I felt the exact same way, but here's how I figured it out. Try and draw them in with some questions that you can ask them. The more conversational it is, the better it's likely to be. Okay, so that means that either they will bring that sort of feel to the conversation, or you're going to have to draw it out of them. So think about that dynamic. You must also be prepared for the possibility that they will ask you all the questions they have. And especially toward the end of the day, when your interviewers are tired, they may just hand the responsibility over to you. What questions do you have for us? I do not want any of you running out of questions to ask, so have 3 to 5 that are prepared. And I will walk you through how to think about that as well. Are there any questions about the structure before we jump into the strategy? Okay, so let's continue. Okay, so the evaluation criteria, I promised I would give you some insight into what they're looking for. They want clear communication on the content of your resume. There can't be any gaps. There can't be inconsistencies in how you respond. What you say shouldn't be a different story from what you gave on the resume, but it shouldn't duplicate it either. So if you're talking about a work experience, I want you to expand on it. Don't just regurgitate what's already in your resume. They don't need you in an interview to read out what's already on paper. Be more specific, provide concrete examples, provide context and color to what you talked about, add in extra data they may not have. And you can also provide human perspective on what the experience of going through that or completing that project or work experience was like. Give them just something different than what's on your resume, but not inconsistent with what's on your resume. Number 2, you cannot be overly general in explaining why you're interested in a firm. You have to indicate that you know what makes that firm different. If the firm has a rotational program, has special secondments that you can do, if the firm has affinity groups that you're really drawn to, if they have a robust mentorship program, speak to the details of that. Let them know you've done your research on the firm. They take that deeply to heart, and they consider that part of their culture fit criteria. You don't want to inadvertently mix or confuse firms with each other. Like if you say, I love your non-rotational program, and they say, well, actually, we have a structured rotational program. I'm not sure which firm you're confusing us with. That's a major red flag. So just have your notes next to you if you need to remind yourself which firms have which distinguishing features. Make sure as well that you also speak to anyone you interacted with, because one of the easiest ways to differentiate a firm that otherwise has similar practice groups to a number of others is to say, what separates your firm from others for me are the people that I met. Your personal engagement and interaction with people and how you got along and how wonderful those conversations were will 100% of the time be accepted as a legitimate reason why you're applying to that firm and not another one, or why you chose that firm as one of your top ones versus another. The people always make the biggest difference. So if you speak to the people you've met, you'll convince them that you're a good culture fit. You want to also explain, if you say, I'm interested in capital markets, or I'm interested in mergers and acquisitions or litigation, why you're interested in that. What class did you take? What mooting competition did you participate in? What undergraduate experience did you have, or legal clinic experience did you have that pointed in that direction? Have demonstrated reasoning for why you're interested in certain things. Don't just say you are. For those of you who are fortunate enough to have had the benefit of somebody you know on the inside of a firm, whether maybe you're connected through a family member, or you've got professional networks who are at the firm, I think it's really important. I think it's really important for you to remember that you aren't exempt from still needing to do the work in the OCI process. These are called shoe-in candidates. Even if you consider yourself to be a shoe-in, I still think it's really important that you take the process seriously. Even if you have internal referrals, you still want to put on as strong a showing as possible. Okay, so now let's take a look at this. Screenshot this if you like, but what I'm going to do is, after this presentation, along with the recording, I'm actually going to be sending a PDF with this criteria in the actual document. So don't feel like you have to squint to see it. I'm giving you an example of a sample interview evaluation form used by law firms. Communication skills are very important, as you can tell. Even if you're virtual, they will still be looking for this. Motivation. So this is your passion and interests, your enthusiasm and energy levels. They do look at that. Your work ethic, the strength of your personal narrative. Highlight and circle this one. You have to actually come across as distinguishing yourself in some way from other candidates. You can't generally be interested in law in general. You've got to have really specific reasons why. Your presentation includes your overall polish and appearance, your demeanor. What is your posture like? Are you smiling? Do you look relaxed? Are you leaning in? Are you kind of vague and distant in the way that you stare around the room? And preparation for the interview, your knowledge of the firm, your enthusiasm about the fit, and your own self-awareness. And that's going to come across in the behavioral questions. This is a more rigid structure, what you're seeing in this evaluation criteria. Some firms are a little bit more relaxed about how they evaluate. They could just have a red light, green light, amber system, yes, no, maybe, and why. So some firms are a lot more open-ended about how they evaluate, but they still have some form of evaluation. Others are more systematic, as you can tell, with tick boxes, exceptional, strong, etc., where they evaluate you from strong to weak. And the bottom line to remember is that if you prepare for the strictest standard, you will have done the work for even the more lax firms. The comments that have come back in the past, so the qualitative data that's been received from employers about certain candidates has been enthusiastic, well-prepared, collegial, open. Other ones that are more negative are defensive when asked about grades, seemed confused about what the firm offers, didn't have a good substance behind the answer as to why they wanted to be in this practice area. Vagaries, overgeneral answers, inconsistent responses are all going to fry you in this process. They are going to tank your interview. So make sure that you use this evaluation criteria to understand, how can I communicate interest, self-awareness, rationale for being at the firm at the highest level, whether or not this particular system of evaluation is used. Any questions before we move on? And I'm not always able to see the chat when I'm screen sharing, so just raise your hand and ask the question if you're able to, please. And I'll look at the ones in the chat toward the end. Can I get a thumbs up and just some feedback on the screen? Is this making sense so far? Are you finding this helpful? It's helpful for me to understand whether or not this is of value to you. So Jessica says yes. Even if you want to just show an emoji on the screen, is this helpful? I just need to know if you guys are on the same page here. Very helpful, says Romeo. Okay, awesome. So you guys are following, everything's good? Let me know if there's anything that's unclear and I'll make sure to clarify. Okay, this is the juicy stuff now. So how do you even prepare for this sort of scary seeming 17 minutes in which you have to prove all of your worth? I'll make it as simple as possible. There's 4 categories of OCI questions I want you to think about. So instead of the entire universe of questions you could get asked, let's break them down into 4 easy categories to remember. Now, if you don't already have me on LinkedIn, please make sure you add me because I will frequently do posts between now and the end of interview week in November with helpful information like this. So one of my most recent posts actually explained these 4, but I'm going to walk through it with you here. The first category of question is the resume-based question. This is your standard fare for any interview. It's where an employer simply says, I see on your resume that 2 summers ago you worked as a server at McDonald's. Can you please tell me what that experience was like? It will typically be fairly open-ended, which means the onus is on you, the burden is on you to then come up with an interesting story around it. Not a general, it was fine, it was okay, I enjoyed it. You actually have to create all of the substance to make that question sound like it was really, really smart and thoughtful. They are purposely not going to give you too much detail on what to talk about in that work experience because they're seeing what you have to bring to the table around it. So resume-based questions are an opportunity for you to carry the conversation in the direction you want that highlights how great you are. And we'll talk about that in the next slide. So with a resume-based question, they're not asking you to just, once again, regurgitate what's already on paper in front of them. They want you to highlight the skills you gained, what you learned, an interesting experience you had while you were there, add context and color. Those are the basic ones you probably already are familiar with from past interviews. Firms are focusing more and more of their attention, however, now on behavioral questions. I'm going to drop the share for 1 second and ask, why are 9 out of 10 questions asked behavioral now? What are the firms worried about? And let's get some participation. If you want to come on screen, I would love that. If you want to put your hand up and speak out loud, I would love that. Why do firms care so much about behavioral questions? So in the chat, Justice says to determine fit. Is somebody willing to, yeah, Justice, go ahead. Do you want to speak out loud?
Yeah, just to mention that I think the firm who have invited you for an OCI interview, they've already seen your resume. So they know that on a baseline you are qualified for the job, but they want to know if they'll be happy to work with you, if you are a fit to the culture at the firm. They imagine themselves working on a trial for 2 weeks and they are stuck with you at 10 p.m. in the office if they are going to be able to work with you. I think that's why they want to know your behavior and if you fit to the culture.
Thank you, Justice. That's the really nice answer, is that, can I work with you really late into the night? What are firms concerned about beyond whether they enjoy working with you? What was the actual harm that came out of the past that occurred when they skipped behavioral questions? What mistake was made that has caused all of them to now be deeply concerned about behavioral side of things? 1, James Key says, can I put you in front of a client? Excellent. There's probably been some serious mishaps that have happened with people who don't have maturity, sound judgment, or client-facing skills, blowing up deals or damaging client relationships because they lacked discretion or professionalism. So it's cost the firm money in the past when they've hired people who haven't been pre-vetted for proper behavioral skills. What else might have been a danger or a harm that firms are attempting to eliminate by focusing on these behavioral questions? Remember, to Justice's point, they know at this stage whether you merit the position or not. They already have your transcript, your resume, and your cover letter. What don't they know that they are trying to figure out in 17 minutes? That if they miss could cause genuine harm to the firm. So damaging client relationships is one. What are some of the other harms they're attempting to avoid or to mitigate? Nobody wants to work in an unhappy workplace. Yes, that's part of it. Like insofar as I don't want to work with somebody who's mean or difficult. Gina. Gina, if you want to say it out loud.
How authentic you are compared to what you have on your resume, and maybe if you're going to be detrimental in terms of, do you respect the firm's regulations, or are you just there for, I don't know, the grandeur, like the.
Yeah. So, I mean, okay, so there's 2 points here. And I want to make this clear. Number one, we established somebody who can't be put in front of clients. To Gina's point, number two, are you intrinsically motivated to do the work? Look, it's no surprise that most people will come to top tier corporate law firms because they need the money. At the end of the day, you're doing a very skilled job for compensation that is proportionate to the skill level. But if that is all you are coming for, if you have no genuine interest in the practice of law, there is no way you are going to withstand the hours and the demands of what it looks like, especially at the junior levels. So they are trying to avoid high rates of burnout and mental health issues in part that come from people who are not genuinely motivated to be there. There's also a degree to which productivity, and therefore the bottom line at a firm, is eroded by toxic people who contribute to a toxic work culture. So if somebody's really difficult to be around and can't be staffed on a team, or when they are staffed on a team, bring down morale, that costs the firm across the board because nobody's able to produce the kind of work they need to. Moreover, that toxic culture can lead to other types of issues. So more employee absences or mental health sort of issues. And so there's a bleed over, a spillover effect, a negative externality that is so far reaching when one bad apple is hired that it wasn't worth it to the firms to bring on a smart candidate who is toxic in nature, or a smart candidate who's only in it for the money, or a smart candidate who has no ability to be put in front of a client. All of those are, in fact, versions of merit. They just aren't solely intellectual merit. So what I want to impress upon you at this stage is that the social behavioral aspects are equally important in the eyes of a firm as your grades on the transcript. And the best part is, if you know how to prepare for this interview in the way that I'm about to show you, you are going to ace this portion. And it is the only portion in the interview, in the OCI interview, that matters. If you have already received an OCI, they have established that you are academically meritorious. So the question is, do you meet the other 50% of the criteria? Are you a good behavioral fit? So let's talk about how to make sure that that's clear now. There are 4 categories of questions. We're going back to this. The behavioral questions are what we emphasized just now. With any behavioral question, the objective is to understand what your consistent internal standard operating procedures are, given it a set of constraints, a specific set of constraints. So what do I mean by that? If we think about how our brains are wired, almost like a machine, if I put you under stress, if I give you a difficult client, if I give you 5 assignments all due at the end of the day, there's actually very predictable ways that you are likely to respond. What are some of those ways that people have responded in your own observation when they're under stress? What are some of the reactions that people have when they're feeling overwhelmed or when they get lots of work piled on them? What are some of the normal responses we have as human beings to stress? Okay, so one response is to shut down because you're feeling overwhelmed. We've all sort of been there. I can't deal with this. I'm taking a step back. I'm just going to call in sick. What are some other ways that people typically respond when they're feeling overwhelmed or stressed? Anger, lashing out, absolutely. For anybody who's emotionally dysregulated or who is not in touch with their emotions, they could go into, absolutely, Uma, they could go into fight, flight, or freeze. We've seen lots of these variations on even TV shows about people at law firms. They'll either, quit, take a mental health break, fail to show up, and that's the withdrawal aspect, or they'll get really upset and lash out and become angry or rude or disruptive or unable to cooperate effectively. Knowing that a typical law firm environment is one in which you will be pushed to your absolute limits in terms of sleep deprivation at times, in terms of workload, in terms of demanding client expectations. The firm needs to know, when put under these set of constraints, how do you typically respond? For anyone who is attempting to veil the fact that they are emotionally dysregulated in this process, I put this to you now. If you say, I'm fine, I don't get stressed, I can handle pressure well, everything's great, they'll see right through that. You are not meant to be a stoic at this stage. You are not meant to be somebody who's so dissociated with their own emotions that you can't even tell when you're upset or stressed. The right approach to a behavioral question is to be honest about the fact that when I feel overwhelmed, it can be, I do actually feel the stress, and here's my strategy for dealing with it. So the correct answer to any behavioral question is actually to demonstrate self-awareness. When I'm stressed, this is how I feel, and this is the systematic process I use to regulate my emotions internally, and then to prepare a strategic, productive, professional response. I'll take a walk around the room and take a deep breath. I'll do a little bit, 5-minute meditation exercise I like to listen to so I can recenter myself, and then I break the big problem down into smaller bite-sized chunks. Or when I get overwhelmed, what I do is I'll just take a minute to write everything down and process it on paper. Have a system that you can think about from now that you use, so that any behavioral question that comes up, you can speak to how you process it. The point isn't to be a machine or to not be human. It's to be a self-aware and evolved human. The third category of questions is called motivational questions. Okay, motivational questions are not just what motivates you. A motivational question is meant to get at the heart of the underlying logic or narrative behind why you've made certain decisions. Quick show of hands, or you can drop it in the chat. How many of you came from a political science background, or a medical background, or an engineering background, something that didn't have to do with law? You guys can either raise your hands or drop it in the chat. How many of you came from a non-intuitive background before law school? When a firm sees this on your resume, what they're going to ask is, so why did you, coming from an engineering or a medical science background or a physics background, or even from, a political science background, why did you decide to go into law? They want to understand how to connect the dots between seemingly disparate pieces of information on your resume. Your response should make it obvious that that underlying connective thread, that underlying logic behind why you went from here to here, is actually a benefit to the firm and not a lack of focus on your part. By going into the biomedical sciences or the health sciences, I actually got exposure to how the health field works. And the reason I'm applying to your firm is because I want to work in health law, and I now have a really solid background and understanding of how that industry operates. Aha, interesting. I see the connection now. A motivational question is often one that a firm will put to you because they're not sure about something on your resume. It is not an opportunity for you to duck and say, oh gosh, I hope they don't ask me this. If there's a red flag or a question mark next to your name and they ask that question to you, so why did you go into law? Why did you spend last summer working in human rights if you're interested in corporate law? Don't shy away from that. They're giving you an opportunity to remove that red flag from next to your name. They're giving you an opportunity to explain something that would potentially eliminate you as a candidate and give them a reason to keep you in the running. Your answer to any motivational question should be, thank you, I'm so glad you asked. Here's why I worked at the UN last summer, focusing on international human rights and how it makes sense based on my interest in corporate law. And you make that connection. I was able to negotiate, treaties. I was able to, work at a high level with high profile clients. I was able to get a lot of good legal drafting experience, all of which is helpful. And part of the human rights issues we were looking at had trade implications. So I actually got industry exposure that would be really helpful for your trade practice here at the firm. Make sense of things that otherwise seem disconnected and connect the dots in a really neat way. Are there any questions so far about 1, 2, or 3? These are the 3 biggest. Are there any questions? Quantang asks, is it a red flag to be a medical science student? No, just connect the dots. Why did you transition from one to the next? What was the logic behind it? Some of the best interviews I have ever borne witness to are ones in which someone gets a question that seemingly catches them out and they're able to flip it from a seeming liability into a strength. They take something that appears to be a weakness, like, weren't you in medical sciences and now you're in law, and flips it on its head and makes it seem like, oh, that makes perfect sense. I can see now why that background makes you an asset to our firm. So motivational questions, if done well, actually put you in the upper end of candidates. Of course, if they're done poorly, then the equal and opposite effect occurs, and you're actually sent down to the bottom of the pile. So they're great opportunities to knock it out of the park if you can do it well. The final category of questions is not one that every firm will ask you. But a couple of years ago, McCarthy's came out of the woodwork and started asking about equity, diversity, and inclusion, and it caught a number of candidates off guard. I do not want anyone who has taken time to be with me here today to feel that they didn't get the full picture of what could be asked. If you get an equity, diversity, and inclusion question, I want you to prepare for the following. And by the way, it could be the case that more firms ask this in the 2L recruit this year. It may not just be McCarthy's. So do prepare for it in case it starts to become a trend across multiple firms. The first question you may get asked is, what does ED&I mean to you? What is equity? What is diversity? What is inclusion in the legal profession? You do not have to reinvent the wheel on this one. You do not have to come up with your own definition. Go onto a few of the firm's websites and find out, how do they define this? And then put it in your own words and, develop a narrative that makes sense based on your own experience. The second question, how do you promote EDI initiatives in your own life, can be attacked in one of three ways, or all three if you choose. Number one is, how do you take initiative to learn about ED&I initiatives or work? This could be reading white papers, attending conferences or panel discussions that your school hosts, and especially during the first weeks of law school, usually there's something about equity, diversity, and inclusion that maybe even the Careers Center will run. So try and look out for those events and attend them so you can speak to it in the interview. The second approach is, how do you promote ED&I initiatives beyond just you educating yourself independently? Are you part of an affinity group at school? Are you part of, say, the South Asian Law Students Association? Do you mentor people who are new to law school from diverse backgrounds? Talk a little bit about that. The third one I would say is, how do you see yourself promoting EDI initiatives at the firm itself? So if you know the firm does outreach events or has affinity groups or a student outreach committee, or if you know, for example, that once you become a fully qualified lawyer, you'd like to be part of a bar association committee on equity and diversity and inclusion, make sure to speak to that. So that ED&I isn't just something you learn about in theory or participate in as a student, but you plan to bring that inclusive awareness to the firm itself. You can also speak to the types of character traits that you intend to exhibit once you're at the firm. Being an active listener, being open-minded and non-judgmental, being somebody who's welcoming to others of different backgrounds. That's also part of exhibiting ED&I, pro-ED&I behavior as a lawyer. You want to explain that you know this, understand it, and are ready to implement it. Is that clear? You can drop in the chat, is all this good? Because we're going to move on from here. Any questions? Just thumbs up or dropping in the chat. We're good? Okay, awesome. Okay. So I want to talk a little bit now about storytelling techniques. There is no way to successfully get through an OCI by simply answering questions in a factual manner. You have to be able to tell stories. Before I actually go into this, can anyone tell me, why does storytelling matter? Why do we bother? Because a big part of my strategy that I'm going to share with you today is about how to create compelling stories. Why do we care? Why do we need to have stories at all in this process?
It separates you out from the rest. Like a lot of people are going to have good answers, like the sort of patent answer that you're supposed to say, but your storytelling then separates you from the rest.
Mm-hmm. No two people are going to tell the same story, even if they worked in the same job. It's just one of the easiest ways to differentiate. But at a deeper psychological level, what does storytelling do that mere communication of facts do not?
Humans also make decisions based off their emotions and how they feel. So if you tell a compelling story, that's something that's going to stand out, and they might make a decision based off of that and not necessarily logic.
Yeah, most decision making, I'm sorry to say, in our lifetime happens from an emotionally centered place. Actually, almost all of human decision making is driven through emotional motivational centers. This has just been studied over and over again in psychology. What we have a tendency to do is when we feel a certain way, this influences our behavior. If we like someone, we're more willing to do certain things than if we don't like them. Even if we think we're being objective, it is not the case. It is only after we have established our emotional position vis-a-vis someone else, like a candidate, that we then use the data on paper to make a post facto justification for why we should or shouldn't hire them. I don't know, that person was on law review and did legal clinics, but I don't think they were sufficiently interested in the firm. That cuts both ways. I mean, maybe they were, maybe they weren't. If they like you, that person did say a few things about why they're interested in the firm. And my gosh, they did law review and were in legal clinics and, you know, they had great grades. We'd be crazy not to take them on. The same data gets interpreted in two different ways. And the only difference is how somebody feels about the candidate. So how do we get to that place inside of our interviewers where they're making decisions from? It's not through the communication of data. It's actually the way that they feel. And the best way to access that part of the brain that's connected to emotions is actually through storytelling. So the storytelling techniques are very, very intentional, and they're a way to access decision-making centers in the brain. So to kind of echo what Hala just said, human beings are motivated to make decisions based on the way they feel and not the way they think. Now, storytelling involves a character, usually a protagonist or what we call the hero, that embarks on a journey through which they overcome obstacles to become a better version of themselves. This is the most compelling story that you can deliver in an interview. By telling these stories, we get to do a few different things. It's an opportunity to reframe weaknesses. Like maybe you got straight B's or you had a couple C's. What were you going through at the time where you had to build resilience and overcome a series of obstacles to even sit for your exams? Because then I'm not looking at the grades, I'm looking at the process you went through to overcome obstacles to make it to the exams. The focus is now on the hero that you became and the resilience you built and not the grades themselves. So stories are an opportunity to reframe weaknesses, fill in gaps in your resume, explain lower grades or less substantial work experience. For example, if you were at home taking care of a sick relative and that's why you weren't participating in extracurriculars, a good story can reframe the skills you got out of that, your discipline, your loyalty, your commitment, your hard work, in a way that will justify why your extracurriculars are a bit more sparse. You can also use storytelling not just to explain away weaknesses, but to enhance strengths. So you can frame a narrative in a way that highlights what you bring to the table. It can help your interviewer understand your passion, your motivation, and your purpose. Why are you even applying? And what are you hoping to do once you're at the firm? By the end of the story, your ultimate objective is to persuade your audience to champion your vision of a future in which that firm, that job, that practice area, and that city is the natural next step in the course of your life. It should be obvious to them by the end of the interview, this person belongs here without question. So how do we do that? I've broken down 5 steps that you take when you're building your stories. Now, this core story / hero's journey framework is especially useful for the first 2 categories of questions, resume-based questions and behavioral ones. There are hundreds and hundreds of variations on behavioral questions you could get asked, and there is no feasible way to prepare different responses for every one of those potential variations. But if you can develop core stories for each work experience and major extracurricular on your resume, they can ask you any behavioral question they want and you will have an answer for it. And we'll even put that to the test today. So in a core story is basically the one go-to story you have in your mind when someone asks you about your work experience. So for example, what you did last summer or the summer before, anything that's on your resume should have a story attached to it. This is predominantly just for your work experience and your major extracurriculars, not the small ones. Don't worry about those. A core story begins with you deciding on a moment in time, a specific moment in that work experience where you were challenged and had to step up and save the day. So let's say you were a server in a restaurant and a huge party comes in and everybody's already busy with other tables and the restaurant is short-staffed. How did you come up with a strategy to ensure that they were seated, that even though there were likely to be delays in the kitchen, that the large party that came in wasn't unhappy? What drinks did you serve on the house? What extra, appetizers were you able to bring out? Think about the moment where you had to think outside the box and really show up for the team. Number one is to set the context. No good story can ever be told when somebody has no idea what you're talking about. For example, if I were to say, 2 weeks ago, my boss asked me to do this job and I did it, and it was like really hard and there were a bunch of obstacles in the way, but I overcame it and it was great. And it was like, I was so happy about it. What would be the immediate question you have if you were listening to me tell this story? What's the immediate question you would have if you listened to a story with that much vagary?
Which job did you do?
Thank you, Romeo. What are you talking about? Which job did you do? What task was this? What boss? How did you overcome it? The last thing you want to do in a good story is to have the interviewer's focus turned away from the point you're trying to make and ask themselves, are they talking about their job last summer? Do you guys know was she trying to tell me about something she did 2 years ago? Which boss was this for? If they don't understand the context, your story is already shot. So context matters. It's the who, what, when, where, why. Okay? You need to make sure that there's enough context to make sense of the details you're about to tell. The next stage in developing a story, a core story, is to ask yourself, what task was I assigned that has a sufficiently high importance attached to it? So if I tell you my task was to go to Starbucks and grab coffee, that's not of sufficiently high importance. But if I tell you it was my second week on the job at 8 a.m., I walked into the office and I saw my boss had a really, really like upset look on his face. So I sat down and I said, is everything okay? And he said, look, we've got a multi-million-dollar client coming in tomorrow. They need answers to where we are on the project, and 2 associates just quit. I'm short-staffed. I'm not sure what to do. In that moment, I knew I had to step up and help deliver on the presentation for tomorrow, put it together and actually present it, or we were going to lose this client. It's a specific moment in time. There's actual consequence if this task doesn't get completed, and it has the level of interest and importance attached to it that's going to draw our interviewers in. If it's just grabbing coffee, it was 8 a.m., it was my second week of work. I walked in and I saw a sad look on my boss's face, and I knew something was wrong. I went up to him and I said, is everything okay? And he said, no, I haven't had my morning coffee. Can you grab me some? Nobody's going to listen to that story. It's just not sufficiently interesting. There's no importance attached to it. It's too low consequence. So when you're picking this specific task that you want to focus on, that moment in time where you were presented with a particular project or assignment, it has to have importance attached to it. That importance doesn't always have to have a dollar value or a high profile client, but it could be something that if I didn't get the research memo done in time, the professor was going to miss the deadline for submitting their next, book chapter. Just have something with consequence attached to it. Is this clear so far? You've got context. What job are we talking about? And what was the specific task of sufficiently high importance? Just drop some yeses in the chat or thumbs up. Are we all on the same page? You guys know where I'm going? You understand what I'm talking about? Okay, awesome. Thank you. The next thing you want to do in this journey is to talk about the obstacles in place. In order for me to get this presentation done by tomorrow, I was going to have to get up to speed on all the research that the other associates who quit had done. I was going to have to familiarize myself with a topic I don't know much about. And I was going to have to be able to get hold of, the client, to ask them specific questions to fill in missing data. And we know the client is notoriously unreachable. By establishing these series of obstacles, we are enhancing the emotional affect. We are dialing up the drama and the suspense that makes any story a good story. If we analogize this to the typical fairy tales we heard growing up, it would sound something like this. The prince was walking through his beautiful gardens one day when he looked up and noticed his messenger was riding on a horse quickly towards him. The messenger came up to the prince, jumped down off the horse, and handed him a letter and said, "Your Highness, this is a really urgent matter." The prince rips open the letter and reads that his beloved has been captured by an evil sorcerer in the next kingdom, and she's been stored in a tower. So we've got a sufficiently high important task, saving a princess who's locked in a tower. If all the prince had to do was go and get the key from his cupboard, walk across the bridge, climb up the stairs to the tower, and unlock the door, it's also not an interesting story. It's only when the prince has to jump across the moat with the crocodiles in it, slay the dragon, jump through the flaming hoop, and scale the wall that we're like, oh my God, is he going to do it? That hero moment is what emerges out of the overcoming of obstacles. No hero moment happens if there are no obstacles. So you have to be able to establish what obstacles were in the way of you completing this sufficiently highly important task. That is step 4. So how you overcame it is actually the most clever part of this whole thing. Not only does it put you in the light as the hero or heroine of the story, but it also outlines the skills that you can bring to the firm. So if you say, I strategized how we were going to manage the project, delegated as appropriate, read through literature reviews to get up to speed on the topic, and then made sure that at the beginning of the presentation, I built rapport with the client and let them know that I'm the new associate taking over the project. By showing that you've taken these steps, the firm can extrapolate that you have the skills needed that would be transferable to a real life context at the firm. In other words, you don't want to make your steps so specific to the one incident that the firm's like, what does this have to do with us? So you don't want it to be like, what does slaying a dragon and jumping over a moat and scaling a wall have to do with us? Because it doesn't have a lot to do with a law firm. But if you say, I developed a strategy, gathered resources, created a timeline, delegated the tasks needed to be done, and made sure that there was sufficient communication between the different parties executing the different tasks to rescue the princess, then they're like, okay, that makes sense. This is somebody who can think outside the box, problem solve under pressure, work well in teams, and deliver on something that they've never done in the past. So they're able to operate outside their comfort zone with a high degree of proficiency. So make sure that how you overcame it and the steps you outline feel relevant to what a firm would be looking for. Step 5 is to have a moment of pause at the end of your story and to reflect. What did you learn from this? What growth did you experience and what skills did you gain? It might sound something like this. When I was given the task, or when the task was presented to me, I was actually really intimidated at first. I didn't know if I could, rise to the occasion. But by challenging myself to complete the presentation overnight, by taking on a heavy amount of research that day, by familiarizing myself with a new topic I'd never done before, I actually built a lot of confidence in myself that I can operate well under pressure, cooperate effectively and communicate with a team, and build rapport with a client. And so with all of that confidence, I'm actually looking forward to growing in these exact ways at your firm, where I know I'll constantly be pushed to challenge myself. And I'm really looking forward to that. So you want it to be a moment of reflection that can include human vulnerability. I was nervous, I was scared, but in doing this, I realized I built my confidence in knowing I can do this in the future. You don't want it to sound too heavy-handed. This is not a hard sell. It's not an after-school special either. And what I learned was it's important to work in teams. That's not what we're going for. We're going for a genuine moment of introspection and self-awareness that comes out as, here's what I can bring to the table for you now, because I've already cut my teeth on something hard in the past. I'm going to drop the share and I want some engagement. Does this make sense? Is this helpful? I just need a couple pieces of feedback here. Uma says yes. What was helpful about this? Are you picking up on how to do this? Is it clear what the system is and the method? Yeses in the chat. Does anyone want to actually speak to this? Can you see yourself implementing it? There's 90 people in the room. Can somebody either turn on their camera or speak out loud and let me know, how did you find this method? Or how can you see this working for you? Nitya.
Thank you, Hannah. So what I like about this is that you've provided a structure to build the story. Like till now, the thing which I'm struggling with is that I'm kind of, sometimes I'm telling the context later on in the story when I should actually start with the context.
100%.
So I really appreciate the structure which you've provided.
Amazing. Thank you for that, Nitya. Amanda asks in the chat, how do we keep all this concise? Because we've only got 17 minutes. Once you've actually prepared the 5 steps, it's a lot more fluid than you would think. Last summer, I worked at a bank. I worked at the Bank of Montreal in capital markets with a team of about 40 people looking at the implementation of a new regulatory compliance rule. I remember it was my 3rd week in the job. I was really excited to be there, but I was the most junior person on the team. We were called into our regular Monday morning team meeting, and we were told that 2 of the main associates on the project I was working on quit. And my boss was very clear that by the end of the week, we were going to have an entire set of documents prepared. I was really nervous, but I put up my hand and said, look, I realize I'm new here and I'm the most junior, but I also am likely to be the most familiar with where we're at. Can I take this on? In that moment, I knew that this was going to be my make or break. If I failed, they were never going to trust me again. And if I did it right, my boss was 100% going to make sure that I got more interesting assignments. So I took the risk. It was not as straightforward as I thought. There were at least a few things that I didn't anticipate. Number one, I couldn't actually get hold of any of the prior work my associates had done. It was behind a firewall and password protected. Number two, my boss wasn't available that week because he was actually traveling to New York. So I wasn't going to be able to ask him for guidance. And number three, there was a series of formulas I was going to need to interpret and regulations I had never dealt with before. So instead of panicking, which is what my initial response would have been, I decided, you know what, I put my hand up, I volunteered for this. How can I get this done? So I first of all got on the phone with the legal compliance team to get up to speed with the basic understanding of what the compliance rules were about. Number two, I was able to look through email correspondence between the associate and myself to find out what attachments they had included to decipher them. And number three, I realized we actually had a template for how the documents should look, so it streamlined the process of inputting the information. By getting resourceful, thinking outside the box, and putting together different pieces of information from different sources, I was actually able to complete this by the end of the week. My boss was thrilled. We actually threw a party for the entire office at the end because it was such a big deal. And I actually ended up getting it this summer. So that was a really great experience. I don't know if anyone timed me, but that wasn't more than 2 minutes. Amanda, is it clear now how you can tell a hero story in less than 2 minutes and still keep within a 17-minute structure? I literally made that up, by the way. So I'm sure that if you guys think about it, you can do it well, but it hit every single point. The point of the core story is not to sound robotic. It's not to sound scripted. It's just to have an idea, almost like a picture in your head, and then to work through it, hitting these major points. When you are preparing your core stories, do not write full sentences. Otherwise, I promise you guys will turn it into paragraphs and scripts that end up being 5 or 10-minute monologues. Bullet points only, 1 bullet per each of the 5 criterion. That's how you do a core story. The more you practice, the better you'll get at it. 1 bullet for each of these 5 sections. Okay, you do this and it'll make for some juicy stories. Imagine being at a cocktail party. Nobody wants to hear a story that's super like bland. You'll never guess what happened to me last summer. So it was Monday morning, the boss called me in and 2 associates had just quit. I had no idea what we were gonna do. That's the kind of juice that needs to go into this. Without sounding gossipy, it sounds more like professional storytelling, but it should have that level of drama. How did you overcome it? Let me tell you. That's how you draw them in and put yourself into the hero's light. Okay. So here's, I've given you an example, so I won't go through this one. I want you now to think about how that story I just told you, the story about, you know, a project, 2 people quitting, due by the end of the week, had to figure out how things were going to get done. Imagine these behavioral questions, the ones that are highlighted in yellow here. Imagine how this could easily be the story you lean on to answer those questions. Describe a time you showed leadership. How did you rise to the occasion? Well, let me tell you about my work experience last summer. I remember I was an associate at the Bank of Montreal in capital markets. And I remember it was a 2nd week into my job and my boss called me into the office for our usual meeting and said 2 associates had quit. It was like we had something due at the end of the week and I had to step up into a leadership role. Are you guys seeing how easily, once you have a story in your head, You can answer almost any behavioral question. How would your colleagues who work with you describe you? Dependable. Why do you say that? Well, last summer in my job at the Bank of Montreal and Capital Markets, there was a situation where, is it becoming clear how you don't have to have a different answer for every behavioral question? If you have a good story, then no matter what question you're asked, it should lend itself to the response. What you need to do is have a sufficient number of of core stories, because you don't want to recycle the same story for multiple behavioral questions. So if you go through every work experience on your resume and every major extracurricular, and you develop a core story, then no matter what they ask you, whether it's a resume-based question or a behavioral one, you will have something that you can fall back on to answer it. Can I get a thumbs up or something in the chat? Is it clear how core stories answer the first two categories of questions now? I want at least 5 answers in the chat or thumbs up on the screen. Romeo says very clear. Amara says clear. I need 3 more confirmations. Is this making sense? Drop it in the chat or put a thumbs up. I need 3 more responses. Clear, says Lauren. Bisco says, yes, it is. Thank you. 1 more. Yes, this makes sense. Thank you, guys. Participation is great. Wonderful. Okay. So now the natural next question that people ask is, all right, so I have a sense of how to approach questions they ask me, but what do I ask the firm if they hand over the reins to me and say, what questions do you have for us? There are 3 rules I want you to keep in mind when you get a chance to ask them questions. Number 1, please do not ask any questions of the firm you don't care about the answer to. It'll be all over your face. Your eyes will glaze over, you'll look bored, you'll slouch, you'll kind of like look off into the distance, and you won't even be able to help it, because this is a draining process. Do not just ask a question to ask a question. Get an answer that you actually care about. You'll lean in, you'll smile, your posture, it'll show in your nonverbal communication. And it's a way of not wasting their time either. There's nothing more insulting than asking somebody a question and then not paying attention to their answer. Rule number 2 is, if you can, please ask questions of the firms that will actually help you differentiate or distinguish between them and other similar firms. A lot of people come up to me and say, look, I really can't tell the difference between firm number 1, 2, and 3. I don't know how to make an informed decision about who to go with or where to drop first choice language in the interview process. And I will tell you, your job is either to differentiate between firms through the research you've done, or by taking advantage of the opportunity to ask them questions. So think about, what do I need to know that would help me distinguish between firm 1, 2, and 3, and then ask that. Rule number 3 is use the question period at the end of the interview to position yourself as a particular type of candidate and to communicate your brand. And there's an art to this that I'm about to teach you. Actually, that element of how to do that, we're going to get to in the brand building section. So hold on to it. How do you use questions that you ask the firm to illuminate your personal brand? I want to get to that in a second. Before I do, I just want to give you some of the sample questions. You can take a screenshot of this. I'll also send you a PDF along with the evaluation rubric after this presentation over email that goes through sample questions you can ask. Why did you choose to work at this firm? What qualities do you look for in a successful junior? What practice areas in the firm are growing? What business development opportunities are there for juniors? Just take a screenshot of this and you can pick out the ones you think are helpful or ones that you care about.